Testing the audio again, trying to get the audio to work. This is extremely frustrating. Please work. Hey everybody, got the audio working, so that's good. It is January 2022, brand new calendar year, and that means once again here on Hail State Debate, it is time to blast off into a brand new topic, and I promise I will try to stay away from the space puns to the greatest extent I possibly can. But on the new resolution resolved, the appropriation of outer space by private entities is unjust. As always, we want this video to be useful to you, so if it is, as I always say, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. As always, the sources and timestamps will be in the description below, and if you'd like to follow us for our general musings on life and debate, you can follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. There is a ton to cover on this topic. That's why, frankly, this video took so long. I'm sorry it is a little bit late, but hopefully you've still got most of the topic time remaining, so it will be useful. But I'm going to jump right into my initial thoughts just to keep us moving efficiently, and I have two big ones at the beginning. The first is that it is a fantastic topic area. The topic wording is better than average, so-so, but not great. So the economic development of outer space is a fascinating general subject area. It sits kind of at the intersection of technology, classical economics, modern economic theory, critical theory because of the limits on who can currently access space, international relations because of treaties and questions about who governs space, even popular culture because like science fiction informs a lot of our intuitions about what corporate influence in outer space might look like. I'd almost say it's almost like too good a topic from a substantive perspective. There are so many angles that can be taken on that it's really not possible to become an expert on all of them. But from an educational perspective to us coaches, it's fantastic. And it really means that people who put in the work, do their research, write their blocks, are going to be rewarded more than folks who just sort of try to wing it. The only reason I say the specific wording of the resolution is so-so is because the term appropriation is pretty vague. It's not clear whether it means like ownership of physical spaces, like parts of the moon or Mars or asteroids or like an orbital path, or alternatively some other type of claim. And also, even more importantly than that, it's not clear whether the term appropriation requires that the private entity just take whatever it's claiming without permission, or alternatively, whether a system of like permissions and regulation on private ownership could be termed appropriation, right? And that distinction is critically important, as we'll see in just a minute, as it means the difference between the negative having to advocate for essentially like a Wild West scenario versus a much more orderly system where like property rights can be doled out in some kind of fair and equitable and careful way. So I guess I would have preferred a little bit less ambiguity on the word appropriation, but other than that, I think it's a fantastic topic, very educational, a lot of strategic opportunities. Second point, by way of initial thoughts, is that storytelling will be key, right? On some resolutions, you can expect most judges, even if they don't regularly judge debate, to come in with a pretty well-developed sense of what like both sides are talking about. So a good example of this is the January PF topic, which is about legalizing drugs in the United States. Well, you know, we all know what drugs are. We've all heard about the drug war and the problems associated with it. We've all seen certain states enacting various levels of legalization of things like marijuana. So with resolutions like that, it's relatively safe to like just jump straight into your more technical information and data and statistics and assume that your judge is following what's going on. This topic is not quite at, but it's close to like the other end of the spectrum, because right, we're still in the infancy of private space development, and most people can't easily picture what it looks like and what it might look like in the future and what's at stake, right? Yes, most people have heard about SpaceX and Blue Origin and some other private space development and tourism companies, but very few judges will know much about what the status quo is in terms of like international law or how many resources and how much wealth is at stake. Most won't know about the science and speculation around asteroid mining or the cost of putting payloads in orbit. So it's going to be really important for you as a debater to connect the dots for your judge. If we do X, we can expect Y. here's what Y will look like, right? This means that cases are not just strings of citations followed by block quotes, but actually include some narrative that you write or you explain what's actually going on in plain English. It means that in rebuttal, you're going to have to be very efficient. Yes, you need to go point by point, but you also need to come back and frame the question and explain to the judge exactly what they're voting on. So like, for example, if the negative is telling the judge these rosy stories about how like a free market lets everyone invest and participate, as the AF, you have to come back and remind them about like the huge barriers to even get into space in the first place, like the literal cost of getting into orbit, which is something that might not be at the front of their mind the way it would be for a more sort of pedestrian topic. So anyway, I think this is going to be a really fun resolution at a really key time of year. It is a potentially complex chess game with a lot of room for creativity and clever angles and strategy, which is what debate is about. So without further ado, let's strap in and blast off. Sorry, I'll stop. Okay, so let's talk about some background and general concepts. We're going to have to move really fast here because there are almost too many concepts on this topic that people aren't going to be super familiar with. So briefly, here's what we'll do. I'm going to start with a summary of the status quo, kind of the legal regime of who currently owns outer space. Then we'll do a super brief summary of what outer space development looks like in the present tense, followed by some common predictions for where it's likely to go, and then some historical comparisons. And all of this is designed to give you a basic flavor of the terrain. But we will, of course, link to resources that are going to go into more depth, which on a topic as broad and novel as this, you will just have to read a lot of if you want to be successful. So without further ado, let's get started. Who currently owns outer space? Of course, you have to start with the acknowledgement that it is a little bit silly for our tiny species to think that it can decide who owns the larger universe, but laying that aside, in our small corner of space, realistically our solar system, we humans have started very slowly making our way out into the universe, which requires us to start thinking about boundaries and who owns what and what belongs to whom. And the best answer to the question of who owns outer space right now might be that the established view is that it belongs collectively to all of humanity, but that is starting to change, which is part of the reason we're debating this topic. So let's start with the established answer under decades-old international law. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is the primary source of international law on the governance of outer space. It was drafted and negotiated under the authority of the UN in the 1960s, and at the time, the US and the Soviet Union were engaged in two major rivalries: the space race to achieve milestones like landing on the moon, and the Cold War, which partly involved the buildup of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could carry nuclear weapons to any destination in the world through outer space. So understandably, countries wanted to try to calm things down before the US, Russia, and possibly others found themselves in an all-out war for domination of this near-Earth space. So the Outer Space Treaty was very timely and it was very popular. It entered into force in 1967. Today has 111 parties and 23 other signatories, including pretty much all of your major world powers. So what does the Outer Space Treaty say about control and governance of outer space? Well, as international treaties go, it's pretty simple. First, you have the specific arms control provisions, which are in Article 4. You can't place in orbit around Earth or any other celestial body nuclear weapons. You can't install weapons of mass destruction on any celestial body like the moon or an asteroid or anything like that, or in outer space, right? You can't establish military bases or installations on the moon or any other celestial body. In addition to the arms control provisions, you have the various provisions that talk about general access and cooperation in outer space. For example, there's a general statement in Article 1 that the, quote, exploration and use of outer space shall, quote, be the province of all mankind. The statement also in Article 1 that, quote, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be free for exploration and use by all states without discrimination of any kind, and, quote, there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. These provisions are important to the topic insofar as they kind of paint a picture of this view of outer space that is what they call at the time a commons for all humankind. It's open to every country, where pretty much any part of it can be accessed and no part of it can really be denied, right? But by far the most important provision for our purposes is the non-appropriation clause of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says, quote, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Now, this provision is only talking about quote, national appropriation by means of a claim of sovereignty. So just taking that language literally, it does not explicitly prohibit private parties from appropriating or taking control of some part of outer space. But Article 6 of the treaty suggests that maybe private appropriation is kind of implicitly prohibited when it says, quote, state parties to the treaty shall bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space, whether such activities are carried out by governmental agencies or by non-governmental entities. That's some pretty ambiguous terminology, but one argument is that this clause implies that anything a nation can't do on its own behalf, like owning a section of space or the moon or something, it likewise cannot do through its private citizens or private companies. Now, all of these fine points about the interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty have been debated among academics for decades, and there's a great summary of the discussion in a 2019 piece by Abigail Pershing in the Yale Journal of International Law. It talks about the interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty with respect to private property rights. And by the way, Professor Pershing comes down on the side of saying that the Outer Space Treaty, based on its drafting history and how the parties understood space exploration at the time, was probably meant to bar private claims of ownership. But laying all that academic stuff and academic debate aside, one thing is very clear in the world today. As a practical matter, in the real world, countries are starting to change their views on ownership and appropriation and development of outer space. When the Outer Space Treaty was adopted in 1967, governments really weren't thinking about economic private development of outer space. That was like a far off science fiction scenario. And so they agreed to this very cooperative, good of all humanity approach, right? It's really easy to cooperate with other countries when you don't think you have anything at stake or anything to lose economically. But now, as it's becoming clearer that outer space development presents this massive potential for wealth, huge quantities of strategic resources and so on, now countries do have something tangible at stake, right? And they're starting to say, no, just hold on a second, right? Maybe we need to rethink this whole common heritage of all humankind thing, right? How did this change come about? Well, first, in the 1970s, following the Apollo mission, the U.S. took the position that while countries can't actually own a section of a celestial body like the moon, they can take ownership of resources that they extract and remove. So, for example, the U.S. government claimed ownership of 842 pounds of rocks and dust it removed from the moon and brought back to Earth. Second, the U.S. further extended this idea of ownership, or at least appropriation, to private parties, not just the government. It passed the Commercial Space Launch Act in 1984, which encouraged private sector space launches. And then in 2015, it passed the Space Act, the acronym SPACE, which stands for Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship. And the Space Act is much more explicit about private appropriation of space resources. It says in Section 51, a United States citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell the asteroid or space resource in accordance with applicable law. And finally, lest there be any doubt whatsoever, in April of 2020, the Trump administration issued an executive order expressly asserting, quote, Americans should have the right to engage in commercial exploration, recovery, and use of resources in outer space consistent with applicable law. So the United States has unambiguously asserted its position in favor of granting private parties the legal right to appropriate resources in outer space. And other countries like Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates have also passed similar laws, and countries like Japan, China, and Australia are also considering similar legislation. Now, as Pershing explains in her article, these countries aren't dropping out of the Outer Space Treaty. Instead, they are reinterpreting the non-appropriation clause of the treaty to say that it doesn't bar private actors from appropriating and owning the resources that they extract from space or from celestial bodies. In other words, they're taking the position, including the United States, nations can't claim territory, right? Whether private companies can claim territory is kind of an open question. We're not really sure at this point, but we know for sure that whatever you extract, like minerals, resources, or whatever, we believe that under the Outer Space Treaty, that is okay. You can do that. The analogy that some folks use here is to the idea of fishing in international waters, right? Under international law, neither a country nor a private company can own a section of international waters, right? But you can fish in those waters, and whatever fish you catch become your illegal property. Now, is this the correct view of international law? We don't know, right? Because there are no decisions by any international tribunal about what it really means at this point. But what we do know is that there is a major push by major powers led by the US to start establishing norms of international law, treaty interpretation, and just general practice that allow for private companies to mine, develop, and generally appropriate resources in outer space. This includes everything from lunar development to asteroid mining to eventual development and mining on Mars to development of like orbital platforms for energy and for research, space tourism, and the list goes on and on, really about as far as the human imagination can take it. So anyway, the short answer to the question of who currently owns outer space is, under the Outer Space Treaty, no nation can claim ownership of any part of outer space, but increasingly, both national governments and private parties are deciding that they can appropriate resources from outer space and own those at least to some extent. So that leads to our second question: how do private entities currently operate in outer space? And we could easily spend an entire video laying out all the ways in which private companies in space are getting off the ground, sorry, I can't stay away from these puns, over the last decade or so. This is something that's probably better covered in other resources in terms of just efficient use of time than if we tried to cover it all here. So I'm mainly going to rely on links to other background information. But very briefly, business is starting to boom in outer space, right? As the Harvard Business Review noted in 2019, the outer space economy produced an estimated $366 billion in revenue, 95% of which is what the article calls space for Earth sector development, which is producing services and goods in space for use on Earth. And right now, these are mainly things like telecommunications satellites, national security satellites, and things like that. This part of the space economy, mainly satellites, right, is pretty mature. It's been developing since AT&T launched Telstar, which was the first private communications satellite in 1962, and it's only accelerating. As the cost of space launches goes down, this is going to keep accelerating more and more rapidly. The next phase of space development is what the Harvard Business Review calls the space for space economy, which is like goods and services produced in space for space. This is like mining the moon or asteroids for minerals or for water that allows the creation of outer space habitats that in turn allows more mining of the moon and asteroids and so on, right? Now, of course, some of these next wave projects will send some goods back to Earth. For example, space mining would almost certainly send minerals back here for use. But generally speaking, this next phase of extracting resources from outer space, right, and turning right back around and using them to create infrastructure in outer space, that is what the next horizon looks like. That's not what we're doing yet, but that's what many believe the next horizon of development is, right? Who are the major movers in the space sector? Why, multi-billionaires, of course, right? The high-profile players are people like Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Blue Origin, and Richard Branson of Virgin Galactic. But there are many other extremely wealthy people and companies who are investing in private space development. Why are billionaires doing this? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's because of something called barriers to entry, right? The barriers to entry of space development are still really high. Until recently, it cost tens of thousands of dollars to put a single kilogram of mass into orbit. Although, as you can see here in this chart, that cost has gone down pretty dramatically in recent years, in part, in fact, largely thanks to private companies like SpaceX developing relatively cheap reusable rockets for launch. So what exactly are these billionaires and their space companies doing? Well, SpaceX was founded in 2002 and has been developing unmanned rockets like the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy to reduce the cost of space launches. It's also looking at other projects like Starlink, which is a constellation of satellites intended to provide internet access around much of the planet, as well as some recent crewed launches with actual people in them. Blue Origin was founded in 2000, also focuses on developing cheaper reusable launch vehicles. It is less commercially successful than SpaceX at this point, relying mainly on personal investment from Jeff Bezos and a handful of small government contracts, whereas SpaceX has some really big government contracts. They also have aspirations of deeper space exploration, like a moon lander. They're the ones who put William Shatner of Star Trek into orbit in October of this past year. And there are countless others like Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic. What do we expect the future of outer space development to bring? Where do these space entrepreneurs think this is all going? Well, the short answer is twofold. In the short to medium term, they think it's going toward massive profits. And in the long term, at least if you believe their rhetoric, how they try to sell it, right, it's going to be the salvation of all humanity. So first talking about the profits. So Clive Thompson in Wired in 2016 wrote this: space is lousy with profits, which he just means it's got a lot of profits in it, right? Consider the asteroid Ryugu. It's made of so many tons of nickel, iron, cobalt, and water, it's worth an estimated 95 billion. Venture deeper into space and there's even richer plunder like Davida, an asteroid that the wannabe space mining company Planetary Resources values at more than $100 trillion, which is more than 5 times the GDP of the US. And if you want a good summary of the sort of pro-free market negative narrative of how private investment in outer space is taking off in recent years, how they're recognizing this potential for profit with some solid background in economic theory, we will link to a summary from the Office of the President in 2021. This is from the Trump administration on the frontiers of space policy and property rights in outer space. And it's sort of a good like pro-free market, sort of economically conservative summary of kind of the pro outer space private development position on like what's going on now. But in addition to the desire for profit in the economics, there's also this like rhetoric about like saving the world. This is a big part of like outer space development. Elon Musk, for example, says that the goal of SpaceX is to establish humankind as a, quote, multi-planetary species with a self-sustaining civilization on another planet whose purpose is to counteract the possibility of a worst-case scenario happening and extinguishing humanity. So people like Musk and Bezos and their defenders talk about private appropriation as, quote, the democratization of space. And they paint themselves as these visionaries moving mankind forward faster, cheaper, and better than these plodding, inefficient like government space agencies. And these narratives are really important. Because as we'll see later in the argument section, like they attempt to infuse the capitalism of outer space with this sense of like adventure and coolness, right? It's no coincidence that Musk, for example, loaded his personal Tesla Roadster onto the Falcon Heavy rocket as the payload on its 2018 test flight and had it play songs on a loop like David Bowie's Space Oddity, right? Space capitalism is just as much about the narrative as it is about the trillions of dollars in resources or any other just practical consideration. It's as much about like persuading people to trust corporations to build their futures as it is like mining helium-3 on the moon. So that's the narrative looking forward. Last question is, what about looking backward? Are there any historical analogies we can look to? Well, absolutely. Human history is full of examples of both private interests and nation states striking out for some like new frontier, some new horizon, and having to figure out how to apportion the ownership, or at least the right to use what you find there, right? And there are all sorts of different models for how to do this. So one baseline example for how public and private interests interact on a new frontier might be the opening of the American West to settlement by white Americans. Now, of course, this process is kind of fraught because, well, white Americans were displacing Native Americans often violently, which was obviously a terrible part of our history. But as a case study of how property rights are handled in a new territory, it is still a useful illustration. And the short version is that Congress understood that for the U.S. to effectively expand westward, it had to give people ownership of the land so that they would have an incentive to develop it and start farming it and start mining it and basically build a nation there. And that's exactly what they did in a series of statutes, like the Land Ordinance of 1785 provided that in newly established U.S. territories, land would be divided up into 640-acre sections, which would be sold to private owners for $1 an acre or $640 a section. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of the land being bought up by wealthy land speculators as opposed to actual like farmers. So 75 years later in the 1860s, Congress passed the first of many homestead acts, which gave people the right to claim these medium-sized 160-acre parcels of land as their own, paying only a small fee and agreeing to like live there and work the land. This was meant to favor small farmers as opposed to rich land speculators. And the reason I mention these is because they're historical examples of private ownership on a new frontier, right? And they're important for a couple of reasons, right? The negative will look at westward expansion and say, number one, there is literally no way the United States could have ever been settled, at least by white Americans, right, without private ownership. Private ownership created the incentive for Americans to go west in the first place and to build things when they got there, right? And the same is even more true for space, right, as vast as it is. The neg will say laws like the Land Ordinance of 1785 show that there are lots of different ways for government to structure the allocation of property rights in a new area like outer space. And that means that like whatever horror stories the AF tells you about how it's going to be so awful and we're going to have these dystopian corporations, it doesn't have to be that way. We can do property rights and do them in different ways ways with different levels of regulation and set them up in more fair ways, like we tried to do with the Homestead Act as opposed to other laws, right, to make it more accessible to regular people. So anyway, that's a lot to take in. I know we're going to have to keep going fast, and I really apologize, but that's just how vast this topic is, like space, right? So with that, let's move on and talk a little bit about definitions and framing. All right, let's do some definitions and some framing. So starting out with the most important term in the resolution, which is appropriation. The exact meaning of this term has the potential to be really important in a lot of rounds. There are some subtle but very important differences in the various definitions of the word appropriate that can have a massive effect on what precisely the AF has to advocate for. So let's look at what those differences are. Webster defines the verb appropriate this way. As you can see, it has to take exclusive possession of, and then the third definition is to take or make use of without authority or right. The Cambridge Dictionary has that appropriation is the act of taking something for your own use, usually without permission. And the Macmillan Dictionary says it's either to take something for yourself or to take something illegally. Now, notice the split we have among these definitions, right? Some are saying that appropriation is just taking something for yourself, while others are saying, no, to appropriate something, you have to be taking it without any authority or right or permission, or maybe just straight up illegally, right? This has a huge impact on the AF's burden, and here's why, right? If the AF has to defend that appropriation is bad, and appropriation is interpreted broadly as anytime you take something for yourself, that means the AF is going to have to advocate for a world where essentially no private ownership of any resource in space exists, period, right? Now, this is a really tough position to defend because, as we talked about earlier, and we'll talk about again on the neg, private property rights in some form are a really basic and arguably essential pillar of most of human history and civilization. And it's made even tougher because the Outer Space Treaty prohibits public ownership of outer space resources, so what's left? Does the AF have to advocate for a world where humanity just doesn't have a lasting presence in space, period? Well, obviously that's an extremely tough burden. But if you instead use a definition of appropriation that requires taking without permission or without right or illegally, then the AF's burden gets way, way easier, right? AF can say, hold on, I'm not necessarily opposed to there being private property rights or ownership in space. What I'm opposed to is corporations and others taking them without any permission in this mad scramble where they just seize whatever they can put their hands on. I'm fine as the AF with setting up an orderly system where, say, some international body assigns and regulates property rights in outer space for things like mining and satellites and tourism. My objection isn't to any of that. It's to companies going out and seizing, appropriating that property just because they can. Might makes right without any permission, right? Well, that's a heck of a lot easier for the AF to defend, right? You're saying this debate is not about whether we have private ownership in some cases, it's about how we set it up. Is it going to be the mad, chaotic scramble where the wealthiest crowd out everyone else through appropriation without permission, or is it going to be something different, like an orderly, fair process where everyone's interests are considered and we dole out some property rights that way? Now, if as the AF you can win this definitional argument and frame the debate that way, that appropriation only refers to taking without permission, that's all you have to oppose. Well, at that point, it's almost hard not to win the round. It's not impossible to lose, but you've got a big advantage, right? Now, for what it's worth, I did look for definitions of appropriation like as a term of art within the specific context of outer space law and policy. In other words, does the word appropriate mean something specific to like authors and experts on space policy? Because if it does, you know, as we say often on this channel, you should prefer a context-specific definition over a general dictionary definition. And the short answer is the term appropriate does appear in space law, specifically in the Outer Space Treaty, but I don't think it really says anything specific about whether appropriation requires a lack of permission. It just really doesn't speak to that question. So I don't think that specific term in the treaty is any better than a dictionary definition. I think you're perfectly safe using standard dictionary definitions, which means on the AF and the neg, you're going to need to prepare some practical, here's why my definition makes for the better debate round theory type arguments for the respective definitions of appropriate. The next definition is outer space. I hope that most rounds won't involve a big fight over what outer space is, but just in case, let's go over it quickly. This is one of those terms that we all sort of intuitively understand, but we rarely define with any precision. The basic question here is, where does the Earth end and outer space begin, right? Now, I've heard one person talking about this topic in a video about like this literal LD topic and argue that maybe some folks might say that Earth is part of outer space, so you have to oppose property rights on Earth as well. But he quickly acknowledged, to his credit, that this is a terrible, abusive, ridiculous argument. He was not advocating it. He told people not to run it, and I completely agree, especially since the word outer, right, in outer space means that it has to be outside something, which customarily has meant it has to be outside the Earth, right? So that still leaves the question, though, where exactly does space begin? Well, to answer that question, we have this really helpful article from Vladian Vereshetin. I'm probably getting that wrong. You know how I butcher names, right? In 2006. And he basically explains that there's no settled definition in international law of exactly where outer space begins. But there is a common sense definition that most parties follow. And I'll put the block quote up on the screen. But the basic idea is that space begins at any point where an object can orbit the Earth in a stable, sustainable fashion. If it can orbit the Earth at that point, right, and not plummet back to Earth, right, and anything beyond that, of course, that's outer space, right? So that starts at roughly 100 to 110 kilometers above sea level, right? And of course, anything out past that, out into infinity, is outer space. So that is a solid scientific definition that's customarily been followed by countries applying international law. It's not recognized by like an actual treaty, but as a good practical working definition, I think it's about the best one you're going to find. Hopefully we won't have to fight over it, right? Next, the term private entities. Now, private entity is not a term of art either, and by that I mean it does not have any like specialized meaning in international law or the literature on space development or economics. It's just a general language term, and usually what it refers to is pretty much any company or organization or group that is not the government, right? In other words, public means the government, private usually just means everything else that's not the government, right? There is a definition of the term private entity in the United States Code, which is our codification of federal statutes, that says, quote, the term private entity means any person or private group, organization, proprietorship, partnership, trust, cooperative corporation, or other commercial or nonprofit entity, including an officer, employee, or agent thereof. That is a nice definition that makes it clear we're not just talking about corporations here. We're talking about nonprofits. We're talking about private groups. We could even be talking about the individual officers or employees of those groups if they do something relevant to the topic. Now, to be clear, this definition does not come from any statute about like space development. It comes from a statute on cybersecurity. So I don't think it has any unique special authority, but it's a generic enough definition that you could argue it applies perfectly well to any field, not just cybersecurity. The bottom line here is, I think, what the negative wants to emphasize is that when we say private entities, we're talking about literally any organization or group that is not a sovereign government. Right? And since the Outer Space Treaty bars sovereign government claims, what the AV is arguably opposing here is any claim by anybody, right? Any group to anything in outer space. That's what a private entity is. That's what's precluded if you add in the Outer Space Treaty, right? So for example, imagine an international non-governmental organization focused on climate change that wanted to say, I don't know, appropriate some territory on the moon, right? To build a huge solar array and like beam the energy back to Earth with some future technology that's probably going to evolve, right? That would seem to be clearly topical under the resolution. Well, what's unjust about that, right? A nonprofit going out there and trying to fight climate change with solar panels on the moon. Most people would say nothing. And what that means, I think, is that the AF is either going to have to argue that, it's not appropriation if you get permission, or it's going to have to come up with some fundamental ethical argument that even if like you're doing good things, it's just inherently wrong for anybody to try to own space, which to me seems like a pretty hard sell. But that's sort of what that definition breaks down as. Last definition is unjust, and I would say that AF has a slight uphill battle due to this term. It's a really strong word for the topic committee to have picked, right? There are endless definitions in philosophy of like just and unjust behavior. Most strongly imply some intrinsic fundamental rightness or wrongness as opposed to just impracticality or something being a bad decision or a bad fit in the particular circumstances, right? In other words, I think most people, most judges would intuitively agree that calling something unjust carries with it a sense of something inherently wrong or bad, not just like a prediction that it will turn out unfavorably. So for example, if we're driving back from a debate tournament and I suggest we stop at a diner and the diner looks kind of sketchy, it's not super clean, and we eat there and people get sick, right? Well, that's something that was unwise on my part. Hard to say it was unjust. On the other hand, if I suggest we stop at a diner that has a bunch of like Confederate flags and racist imagery hanging outside of it, well, that's probably going to be qualified as unjust since there's something intrinsically morally wrong with that course of action, no matter how good the food is, right? So one thing the neg may want to lean into heavily is the idea that unjust is a higher standard than just bad, right? To meet the unjust standard, the app has to do something more than just give you a utilitarian analysis of why private appropriation in outer space won't go well. They have to show you that there's something fundamentally always wrong with it, such that even if good stuff happens, even if the nonprofit goes out there and fights climate change with solar arrays or something like that, right, it's still bad for some reason. And that's actually a nice transition to discuss values and criteria. Now, we're not going to spend much time on this at all just due to time constraints, but very briefly, if you watch the channel, you know I'm not a fan of exotic values. I think values are supposed to be the unambiguously good thing, like the lodestar you look to, right, that if you achieve it in this debate, nobody should really be able to question that it's a good thing and that warrants the ballot, right? And in particular, when the resolution hands you a stock value in the actual wording, as this resolution does by using the word unjust and thereby pointing us toward justice, I tend to defer to using that value. Why? Well, because if you don't, that's just one more step in the logical chain, the logical syllogism, where you have to make a link between, let's say, if you choose morality, then you have to link morality to justice, or if you choose autonomy, you have to link autonomy to justice or whatever. And that's just one more thing for your opponent to attack. It's one more thing to spend time on. And particularly, if they go with the standard of justice, if your opponent does, they're going to say, well, look, I'm appealing to the standard that's actually in the resolution itself, whereas my opponent is not. So long story short, my suggestion is keep it simple and go with justice as your value. In terms of criteria, just a few quick thoughts. Like I said a second ago, I think the AF really wants to emphasize some aspect of inherent wrongness of private appropriation, which means I would probably stay away from strict utilitarian standards on the app, because utilitarian analysis leans heavily into like predictions about what's going to happen, particularly on a topic where all of the or most of the relevant decisions and outcomes still lie ahead of us in the future, right? So if your standard, like utilitarianism, admits that the rightness or wrongness or something depends on the outcome, depends on contingent future events, which is indisputably true, right, with space development, it's harder to characterize that as unjust, right? Race discrimination is unjust, denial of bodily autonomy is unjust, genocide is unjust, making the wrong bet on how using outer space will work out, harder to argue that that is unjust. Unwise? Yes. Unjust? It's more questionable, right? So instead on the app, I think you really want to lean into a more like deontological standard, right? So for example, standards that look to equality, egalitarianism, saying it is inherently wrong to let a tiny minority of humanity become oligarchs, right? Standards that look to critical theory, racial bias, things like that, because most of these oligarchs, if we look at the status quo, are going to be white men from wealthy countries, right? Standards that look to benefiting the poor and the downtrodden, like Rawlsian justice, which lets you make most of your utilitarian arguments, but couches them in terms of it just being intrinsically right to favor the least advantaged and intrinsically wrong to favor the most advantaged. And because unfettered capitalist exploitation of space favors the most advantaged, it's intrinsically bad, right? These are probably better options for the AF because they deny the negative the ability to say, you know, if at the end of the round you think it's a question of the outcome, then that's not unjust, right? On the neg, I'm all in favor of things like rule utilitarianism. I think the AF has to show you that a flat rule against any private entity owning or holding any property in space is what's going to yield the best outcome for the most people. So I, as the neg, am going to apply rule utilitarianism and ask, is that the best rule for humanity? And by the way, this is all occurring alongside international law that says governments can't do anything. So is the best rule basically a universe where we really, as a practical matter, nobody can do anything to use the resources in space? Is that the rule that maximizes happiness for the most people? And you would say, no, it's not. We should have a different rule, right? We should have a rule that allows at least some private appropriation under some scheme, right? So anyway, those are just some general thoughts on how the values and criteria might play out. AF more toward deontology, maybe things like virtue ethics, things that are intrinsically right and wrong, neg more toward like measuring outcomes through utilitarianism. So now let's move on to the part you've all been waiting for, AF arguments followed by neg arguments. Okay, so affirmative arguments. Just to briefly recap, remember, I think the core theory of the affirmative is that appropriation means taking resources or territory without authority, without legal authorization, and that all the AF is advocating for in this case is some orderly, fair system for apportioning ownership interests or the right to use resources in space. I, as the AF, do not have to advocate for barring all private ownership, just preventing a scenario where ownership or rights are decided by who can seize the most territory without permission. And if you believe that any national or international system of assigning rights is preferable to this free-for-all land rush scenario where might makes right, you should be voting AF. That is your basic paradigm on the affirmative. If you win that, you've got a big advantage, but there are still plenty of factual showings that you have to make. So let's just jump right in to some of the particular ways you can come at this argument, right? The first big point of my outline is unregulated appropriation of space leads to domination by the ultra-rich. Space-based industries, regardless of the type, satellites, mining, tourism, you name it, as we said earlier, have some of the highest barriers to entry of any industry in the world. And as we said, barriers to entry is an economic concept. And what it describes is the level of resources you need to even begin competing in a given field. So, for example, the barriers to entry to becoming like a famous YouTuber or an Instagram influencer are pretty low. You need a camera, maybe some lights, a microphone, maybe some editing software, and you're good to go. All the way at the other end of the spectrum, putting things into space, right, no matter what it is insanely expensive, right? And this means that the people who dominate this field are going to be insanely privileged folks and frankly, white American and European folks. And we have a couple of sources on this, some that are very scholarly that we will link to, so feel free to read those. But just for the sake of time, a pretty simple explanation of this concept comes from Emma Backey in 2018, where she talks about wealth disparities in space resource appropriation, right? And she says this: it takes extreme wealth and more than that, privilege to be able to even make it into space, let alone mine those space resources. Although there are more players in the space race today than there were 20 years ago, many developing countries are still excluded from participation due to divisions in wealth and technological innovation. I'm reminded of Elysium, which is a movie she's talking about, a world divided, two different paths taken by Earthlings, one utopian and one dystopian. The political and economic post-apocalyptic possibility of an Elysium-esque world, a prediction of massively broadened global wealth disparities, is all too realistic, a possible and unaccounted for economic and social result of commercial space exploration and space resource manipulation. Right? So the basic idea here is that it's going to exacerbate and increase wealth disparities, because to get there and to be able to harness these resources, you have to be rich to begin with. Add to this fact that the ultra-rich basically means right now rich white Americans and maybe some rich white Europeans and almost nobody else. I'm not going to cite a source here, but it's just common knowledge that the big three space entrepreneurs right now are Elon Musk, who is a South African/American apartheid emerald mine heir, Jeff Bezos, who's one of the richest people in the world, at any given time maybe the richest person, who's a white American, and Sir Richard Branson, who is a British billionaire, right? The barriers to entry in space development are so astronomically high that it is virtually guaranteed if we allow free market capitalism to operate as the primary mechanism for development, it will not only perpetuate massive global wealth inequality, but dramatically increase it. And while we don't have time to link to like a ton of sort of critical theory argument stuff here, and I'm not an expert on that stuff anyway, you probably wouldn't be the person to ask about it, please know this is the starting point for that, or at least it's one starting point. The idea that a handful of rich white guys are going to be the elites who get to harness this and get even more wealthy and even more powerful, while many people in the global south do not, is sort of the core of that critique of space capitalism. Now, shifting gears slightly, my next point in my outline is unregulated appropriation creates disasters and existential threats. Basically, the idea is that letting private corporations run out and grab whatever they want not only will have disastrous consequences in the future, right, but it's already empirically causing huge threats to humanity and the status quo. So the note I have here is free market satellite launches are already creating huge space junk problems. And this is from John Holden in the Irish Times in 2018. And what he says is that earlier this year, India broke all previous records by launching 104 satellites at once into orbit. Cool, except those 104 satellites are destined to become 104 or more pieces of trash floating around in space. Satellite technology in its current state is the new light bulb of planned obsolescence. What could be a more iconic symbol of our wretched love for creating waste than flying devices designed never to return, right? And of course, as he points out, putting satellites into space, right, is a form of space appropriation. You're claiming one of these orbital paths for yourself. You're not asking anybody. There's only weak legal authority about where you can put them. You just park it there, right? It's one of a large but finite pools of potential orbital paths. So what happens to this space junk, these satellites and abandoned satellites and destroyed satellites? Well, it's a massive threat to life on Earth. Dr. Nikita Chu in 2019 noted in an interview that it creates serious threats to life on Earth, right? She points out that, made up of hundreds of thousands of pieces of defunct satellites and fragmented artificial objects in major orbits, with some as small as 1 meter long, some traveling up to the alarming speed of 17,000 miles an hour. It's a growing phenomenon that much of this space debris could wipe out many of our space-based capabilities, including weather forecasting and GPS positioning. The growing collection of space debris could collide at any moment, and in the worst-case scenario, create a chain reaction leading to a colossal collision detrimental to major orbits. Just think what that might look like. If the entire low Earth orbit was erased, capabilities including Earth observation, early warnings for natural disasters, and weather forecasts could be severely undermined. So already in the status quo, we're creating risks of massive dangers, right, and cost to human life. But even worse than that, space junk could trap humanity on Earth for long periods of time. So Sophie Weiner in Popular Mechanics in 2017 notes that space junk has the capacity to trap humanity on Earth. Space agencies are tracking 750,000 pieces of space debris orbiting the Earth. And the more of these objects we put up there, right, she points out, the more of a minefield we're creating every time we try to launch something new. And eventually, as you can see in this chart included in the article, we're going to create such a minefield, right, of these objects that you run into at tens of thousands of miles an hour. They become like a little bullet just ripping through the spacecraft, right, ever. And it is entirely possible, as she points out, that this could prevent experts believe, prevent us from being able to safely and readily escape from Earth at all, to leave Earth's atmosphere at all. You don't have to wait for a dystopian future of like worker exploitation on moon colonies, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You should just know that right now we're already endangering our ability to predict disasters and our ability to get into orbit at all. And by the way, this serves as a nice turn on any attempt by the NEG to argue that like private development is the key to colonizing Mars to serve as like a lifeboat for our species. Your response is not only do we not need private development, but unregulated private development right now is creating this minefield that's making it harder and harder for us to get into space at all, and more dangerous, and may trap us on our own planet at some point, right? Third point on my outline is an orderly, regulated approach benefits all, right? So having established, however you want to do it, that this unregulated approach is a disaster, it's dangerous, right? The app next needs to show that there are better alternatives, right? That an orderly, regulated approach to property interests, not Wild West appropriation, but a methodical, fair apportioning, is something that can get us most, if not all, of the gains of free-for-all development without any of the costs, right? So there's this piece from Saletta and Orman Rossiter in 2016 that says all of humanity should share in the space mining boom. And what they point out is that there's massive riches in outer space, right? Huge amounts. But the question is how we're going to divvy it up among, different groups. Is it going to be the Wild West frontier where first come, first serve gets obscenely wealthy? Or are we going to take a second to stop and think and come up with a system that allows us to use the massive wealth, the massive mineral wealth, the massive opportunities for economic growth in space in ways that help everybody? And they say it's a no-brainer. We have the opportunity now on the front end to design a system that is not Wild West appropriation, but rather that is thoughtful and benefits everybody. And the model that they suggest is the Alaska model for divvying up revenues from oil fields. This is a pretty long quote, so I'm not going to read all of it. But as you can see here, the model that Alaska came up with in the 1970s was rather than just letting private companies come in and buy up their oil fields, they leased the fields out to these companies who in turn pay royalties, and those royalties are distributed right to Alaskan citizens. The first payment totaled $2,072 per citizen per year, and it has increased since then, right? They talk about how there are other models like the International Seabed Authority, but basically what they're pointing out is that there are many ways we could design a system where instead of having Wild West appropriation of property, we lease out claims on the moon and on asteroids, claims to orbits to put satellites into, whatever you want to do, and we tax them or we take royalties from them and we distribute them through some international body. It could be the World Bank, it could be, some other institution to benefit every human being in the world. And the billions or trillions of dollars of mineral resources out there not only allow us to have more resources, but rather than going into the pockets of a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk or the Warren Buffetts of the world, right? They go into the pockets of people around the world, which is a major way of alleviating wealth inequality and other problems. So I think this is a really nifty model where you can say this is the alternative to appropriation, right? It's a model that's worked in Alaska, that helps regular people, that gets all of the benefits of private development, but doesn't use them to simply purely line the profits of wealthy people, because it doesn't allow just sort of Wild West appropriation. There are other approaches. For example, there's a model called the Artemis Accords, which is a model international agreement proposed by NASA to govern exploration of the moon, Mars, and orbital systems around both. And what it calls for is countries around the world to come together and contribute to multilateral efforts to develop international laws and practices for how to allocate rights to the extraction of space resources. It's not very specific. It doesn't say tax and distribute. It just says we need to get together and come up with a system to have an orderly allocation. And this is a proposal from NASA that currently exists. So you could say implement the Artemis Accords instead of having free-for-all Wild West appropriation. But there are a lot of different ways to do it. The point is, you as the AF need to be pointing out that there are different ways to do it. And I think that idea of sort of playing small ball, right? These arguments that I've been talking about so far have been more conservative, limited arguments that I think win the round for the AF by narrowing the conflict down as much as possible, saying all I'm advocating for is some kind of system to equitably allocate private interests, right? To tax them whatever, right? Not a free-for-all. But I recognize that not every debater is going to approach it that way. A lot of people writing on this topic want it to be a debate about, like, for example, why capitalism is just bad and why putting capitalism into space perpetuates and exacerbates that bad system. That's not necessarily the argument that I would run, but it is a viable case, definitely. So what we're going to do is spend some time discussing the different versions of these sort of anti-space capitalism arguments that you're likely to see. So the first note on my outline in this section is space capitalism is necessary to perpetuate the harms of capitalism generally. Like, this is the argument that moving capitalism into space is kind of like putting the evils of capitalism on life support, right? So let me just preface this by saying, I think when a lot of people run like anti-cap arguments, right, cap Ks and things like that, they think about critical debate. They think about obscure, jargon-heavy argumentation that's kind of designed to honestly confuse the opponent. I'm not a fan of that. I don't think it's a good way to win. I think it's a huge risk with non-technical judges. So I'm going to try to explain the critiques of capitalism as it applies to space development in as practical, simple a way as possible. And I really do recommend that you do the same, because I think that allows you to succeed both with progressive judges and lay judges. There are tons of authors and cards on this, way too many to cover. I'm not going to attempt to do a survey of them. What I'm going to instead try to do is walk you through a clear, sensible story of how you can attack the idea of space capitalism, why it's problematic, in very simple, straightforward terms. So, to run a case about why space capitalism is bad, the first thing you have to do is establish some argument about why capitalism as a general matter is problematic. We are not going to spend a ton of time on this, not because it's not controversial. It is controversial because it's something that's been talked about to death within the debate community and in academic literature generally, and there's not a lot that I can add. You can absolutely find some excellent evidence out there on tons of debate websites and Reddits and things like that about why capitalism, at least allegedly, is exploitative, unsustainable, and based on lies, whatever you want to say. I know you can find that stuff. If you want a few quick suggestions, I'll just do a couple. A quick, succinct, layperson-friendly argument about the problems of capitalism and why it's unsustainable comes from Jason Hickel and Martin Kirk in 2017. And they talk about how there's a fundamental flaw in the premise of capitalism is that it requires constant growth. It is built around growth. Capital institutions exist to expand themselves and continually grow and get more profitable. Human beings are a means to that end, and the growth can never stop, right? So that's one argument, is that it's an unsustainable system that uses human beings and burns them up and burns them out, right? And that putting it into outer space, right, by extension, is what needs to happen to perpetuate that, which we'll talk about in a second. At the other end of the spectrum of complexity about why capitalism is problematic, you could go all in and learn the sort of core arguments, about Marxist critiques of capitalism, about why it's sort of a parasitical system that exists to extract as much value from workers as as possible. Marx called this surplus value. He said that capitalists use their unequal bargaining power and other advantages to extract the value of your labor as a worker, paying you as little as possible to transfer value from you as a worker to themselves. And if you want a summary of why this basic argument works without having to read all of Das Kapital, we'll link to a good page on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy with a good summary, right? So that is a really quick rundown of just a couple of options you can look at to start sort of my first capitalism critique argument if you want, right? Don't have enough time to cover all of it. But if you agree that capitalism is exploitative, right? If you believe that it is bent on growth, that it has to keep growing and using people and that it's problematic, right? The next question is, why is space so essential to that? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are many possible answers, but let's look at a few. The first one is that expansion into space is necessary to meet capitalism's inherent need to expand. This is from Shamas and Holin in 2019, and it basically argues that expansion into space is not just something capitalism is doing for fun, it is necessary to keep capitalism alive. And they talk about this idea of what's called a spatial fix. A spatial fix to them is a technical term that means sort of expansion or changing of capitalism into a new area, right? They say the outward drive of capitalism is inherently limitless. There is no endpoint or final destination for capitalism. Instead, capitalism must continuously propel itself onwards in search of pristine sites of renewed capital accumulation. In short, outer space serves as what they call a spatial fix. It swallows up surplus capital. That means you can send the money you have out there to invest it, promising to deliver valuable resources, technological innovations, and communication services to capitalists back on Earth, right? This places outer space on the same level as traditional colonization, right? In addition to being a place for capitalism to go to keep expanding forever, which is what capitalism intrinsically wants to do, right? It also notes that modern space capitalism creates this false view that capitalism is inherent to the human condition, right? And it's not a choice we make. And they write, but there is something new at stake. Capitalist kind consists in the naturalization of capitalist consciousness and practice, the false universalization of a particular mode of political economy as inherent to the human condition, followed by this projection of naturalized university into space, right? The very centrality of these maneuvers has initiated a new phase in the history of capitalist relations, that of charismatic accumulation, certainly not in the sense of any objective or inherent charismatic authority, but in a form of an illusion, vested in the members of capitalist kind by their uncanny ability to spin mythologizing self-narratives. They talk about Henry Ford and others, and now they say that every SpaceX launch is a quasi-religious spectacle, observed by millions, capable of producing a real sense of wonder and a condition of legitimizing collectivist effervescence. Now that's some highfalutin language, but the basic argument here is what we talked about a few minutes ago. Capitalism, according to these authors, is like, if you'll forgive the term, a cancer. It has to keep expanding outward to survive. That's what it is. That's what it does. Growth is the point. Human beings are just a means to the end of perpetual growth. More specifically, when the expansion or movement stops or slows down, people start looking around and saying, hey, maybe we don't necessarily have to live this way where we're constantly churning to make profits for the capitalist system for our employers. Maybe this constant never-ending growth and cutthroat competition that really only benefits the elites, maybe this isn't the only way to live. In other words, what Marx would describe as class consciousness begins to develop when you sort of reach the limits of what capitalism can do, right? People start realizing that the rich aren't just people like them who worked hard. They're the beneficiaries of a rigged, biased system that will never really work in the interest of regular people. That's what Marxist theory says, right? So right now, what we have been seeing in recent years in Western countries and in the United States is this rising class consciousness. And because that's happening, that makes space expansion essential to maintain the myth of capitalism, right? So in recent years, we've been seeing this awakening of class consciousness in developing countries. So Fitzgerald and Black in 2020 talk about polling showing increased support for socialism in the United States. Within the Gen Z group, ages 16 to 23, that's you guys, right? Support for socialism increased nearly 10 percentage points over the course of a single year, from 40% in 2019 to 49% when this poll was taken in September 2020. Felix Salmon in 2021 looked to polling showing declining support for capitalism. In 2019, 58% of Americans aged 18 to 34 reacted positively to the word capitalism. That's plunged to 49% today. Back then, 39% of all U.S. adults viewed socialism positively. That has since ticked up to 41%. right? So with all of these changes and this greater class consciousness and this greater sympathy for socialist ideas and skepticism of capitalism, well, you know what that means, right? Just like when people in a country are upset with the government, you need to start a war to gin up patriotism. When people are starting to get upset with capitalism, you need a big, glitzy, high-profile expansion of capitalism, what Shamas and Holding call the spatial fix, right? To get them back on board the capitalist train. And that's exactly what space capitalism is doing. It's this massive, elaborate show of charismatic billionaires going out and colonizing the solar system and telling you that you, a regular person, can be part of this adventure too, with populist PR stunts like Elon Musk putting his Tesla in the Falcon rocket and playing Space Oddity on the radio, right? It's the big, new, bright distraction from the fact that capitalism does not serve your interests. The new horizon that wealthy elites can point to and say, your prosperity is just over that next hill if you will just come along and follow my plans, or just on the next asteroid or the next moon or whatever. It's the same thing that we've been doing from colonial expansion to westward expansion in the US to the post-war boom where we built the suburbs to the rise of cryptocurrency. It is the new thing that's going to make rich people richer and make regular people think capitalism is finally about to work for them. So the basic argument here is just that space capitalism is bad mainly because it's the latest attempt, the latest gimmick, the latest trick to delay and prevent the development of class consciousness, which would push back against the excesses of capitalism and look for better, more humane models of the economy and human existence. And that's the core, non-technical, common sense, anti-capitalist critique of private appropriation in space. But to be fair, there are many other angles you can take. So for example, space capitalism will yield unprecedented worker exploitation. There is this piece from Paris Marx in 2020 that argues that just the cost of transit to an off-world colony, right, eventually would be so expensive, like $1 million a piece, that Elon Musk is already joking that there will be essentially indentured servitude to pay off the debt. More seriously, there's this piece from Kasparov in 2020 that talks about how space colonies, private space colonies, will by their nature be undemocratic and exploitative. And they talk about how, here on Earth we see worker exploitation, but imagine how much more leverage you will have when you have somebody on a space station or on the moon or working on an asteroid or on Mars, right? It might not happen immediately, but the conditions are almost inevitably going to drift towards an exit ticket being too expensive to afford. There'll be literally no way to get out, and these corporations will have total leverage. And if you're a gamer, if you've played like video games like The Outer Worlds, for example, this is a perfect example. You essentially sell yourself to a company to take you out to a space colony, and when you're there, for all intents and purposes, they own you, right? And an even more sort of extensive critique on this front is Keith Spencer in 2019 on the leverage to exploit workers in space. And he just talks about how when you're in a place where you literally cannot stay alive without the services that the company provides, right? Where communication with Earth takes 40 minutes minimum. The idea that you won't be exploited is pretty remote. He makes the comparison to like grotesque, horrific tales of sexual harassment in Antarctica at research stations. And they explain how this barrenness and this isolation makes it possible for companies to grossly exploit workers. And this is one reason why we don't want unaccountable private entities that don't have regulation like governments do, right? Doing the driving of the development of outer space. On a related point to this, an even stronger argument, to this effect, is that private appropriation of the boundless resources of outer space will basically create these ungovernable oligarchies of megacorporations that can't be controlled, right? The idea here is to turn Aff's arguments about like, oh, there's trillions of dollars of minerals and asteroids against it by saying, yes, there are trillions of dollars in minerals out there. There's untold wealth. And if you let private entities go out there and seize it and take it without any form of regulation, without any form of like royalty payment or control by any higher authority, they will become mega corporations, right? They'll become even bigger. They will do it because nobody else has the resources, right? And these mega corporations will become exponentially wealthier, and they will become harder to physically reach by governments, meaning that they will, at minimum, ignore attempts at regulation, and at most they may potentially declare themselves autonomous and rule their territory however they choose. And we see this trope a lot, again, in science fiction, right? Again, looking to the piece by Kasparov, And I'm just going to read a little, but I think he explains it better than I could. The primary avenue for wealth creation in space will be mining. The vast number of material resources available on the nearest celestial bodies, combined with the potential for strip mining, means that the first few corporations to mine in space will be wildly successful. Goldman Sachs claims that the first trillionaire will make their fortune in space. After purchasing competing rocket programs to create an oligopoly on access to space itself, these companies would quickly dwarf today's earthbound megacorporations. Once these corporations are off Earth and recruit a space-based working class, to which government will they answer? What would stop these corporate settlements from arming their borders, proclaiming themselves free from governance, and lobbying Earth politicians into the ground with their newfound billions? Current governments are running a deficit to pay for healthcare. The notion that they could finance a fleet of rockets to enforce bureaucratic regulations is a fantasy. And returning to my narrative here, if we let megacorporations seize the unprecedented assets, right, they will use it to ensure perpetual scarcity and market domination. By contrast, if we conduct space mining via some cooperative public efforts, we will eradicate much economic scarcity forever. So Rove continues, if these space mining initiatives are powered by economic democracy, this is the other alternative, humans can have access to all the materials they require. The trove of metals and minerals will be at the behest of society as a whole, eliminating the politics of scarcity. Without such scarcity, an entire upper bound for human advancement and consumerism would disappear. Under the influence of capitalism, however, the process would be much different. Spacefaring miners could flood the market and bankrupt miners on Earth repeatedly. Then they would leverage another monopoly and most likely follow in the diamond industry's footsteps, choking out supply to keep prices high. So the basic idea here is, if you precisely because there is so much wealth in space and because it is so far away and so hard to reach, if you turn private development loose in outer space, you're basically forsaking the ability to ever control them again. Right? You're going to get these outer space megacorporations that simply cannot be controlled. You will not be able to put the genie back in the bottle, right? And I think that's a really neat, powerful argument, right? That's a reason why we were talking about earlier, why it's intrinsically bad. Not just not ideal, but intrinsically bad, right? And then another point I have is that there's just no need to rush, right? Private appropriation cedes control of humanity's destiny to the wealthy. Like, why do it now, right? Countless practical and ethical questions need to be answered before the development in the solar system and outer space can proceed safely and ethically. For example, how do we distribute all the value ethically? We talked about that earlier. How do we ensure human rights in these incredibly hostile environments? How do we account for the rights and interests of maybe potential life or proto-life that we might find like under the ice on some moon of a gas giant, right? Moving forward collectively and slowly using a deliberative process built on global consensus will give us time to answer these questions, right? Whatever the answers are, a slow collective consensus government process will let us think about them and answer them. Private corporations, by contrast, are not going to wait to answer questions about human rights and ethics and what happens if we meet life. They're going to pursue profit as fast as they can with no regard for collateral consequences. That's what they do here on Earth. That's what they'll do in space. Worse, once they have moved to start the competitive rush into space, it will be impossible to stop them, as we talked about earlier. They'll become more powerful and influential. They'll do whatever is in their interest. And we are talking in very real terms about the oligarchical megacorporations of science fiction like Alien, Blade Runner, and so on, right? But right now, none of that has happened. We have a golden opportunity to prevent that from happening and to ensure that the next frontier of humanity develops in a measured, collective, equitable, sustainable way. So why let the genie out of the bottle? Why allow them to go seize control of it, right? Dr. Linda Billings in 2019 talked about the need to delay space colonization and address ethical issues first, right? And she talks about how there are all these ethical questions that we need to answer. And she talks about what I just said, which is that there's absolutely no reason to believe that these private corporations would care at all. And she says it would be immoral to transport a tiny non-representative subset of humanity to live on Mars, as Elon Musk seems intent upon doing. The moral thing to do right now is take care of our home planet and all life on it, life that evolved to live on Earth. We likely have another 100 years of work or so to do before we will be ready to fairly, equitably, and safely begin the process of expanding human presence into outer space, right? And so the basic argument here is pretty straightforward. It's if you can get the judge to agree that there's some kind of time frame here, right? In other words, it may be that someday we are ready to allow some amount of private ownership in space once we have gotten there and established a controlling framework for it, right? That may be okay. If you can get the judge to agree that there's some kind of time frame here. But until we get there, until we have asked ourselves what the rules ought to be, until we have, government and some kind of collective authority out there to enforce the rules, it is way too premature. So right now, it is absolutely unjust to turn people loose, turn mega corporations loose to go out there and basically seize control. Anyway, as you can see from some of these arguments, there are so many different directions you can go with the AF, too many to name. So those are just a sampling of some potential AF arguments. But anyway, that's all the time we have for AF, so we've got to move on. So let's move on and take a look at the negative side. Okay, so first of all, wow, I really need a haircut, like really bad. Like I'm supposed to be like a grown adult man who like wears a suit to work, and this is out of control. Anyway, let's get started with the negative. So on the negative, I kind of want to start with the same basic premise I started with on the affirmative, which is just remind you what I think your sort of core theory is in terms of like definitions and what your territory is. Remember, again, we said there are two definitions of appropriate, right? And the negative is clearly going to want to go with the one that simply refers to taking exclusive possession with no limitation about doing so without permission. And if you win this definitional argument, that means that negative ground is not limited to a world where private entities can just do whatever they want. You don't have to defend a Wild West. Instead, if you win this argument that appropriation is just any taking of possession, right? That means neg ground includes any system in which private entities can own or otherwise have any enforceable claim to resources anywhere in space. That becomes negative territory, right? What this allows you to do, whether in an observation or a contention or just responding to cross-examination or whatever, is to say, in effect, look, affirmative, I understand you don't like the super wealthy dominating outer space. I don't either, right? But you, affirmative, have to advocate for a world without private ownership in space. Any system that allows for private ownership, no matter how it's allocated, if it's allocated on an equitable, fair, international basis, if it looks out for the interests of, of the poor, right? Which is, by the way, I think it should. You can say that is all negative territory. And so what this does, right, if you win this, is this effectively turns all of the AF arguments earlier about like valid alternatives, it turns them from being AF arguments into being negative arguments. So for example, when we're talking about the Alaska system of granting licenses for companies to mine asteroids, or the Artemis Accords, or anything like that, that allows for some form of private development under a strict system of regulation or paying royalties or something about that, you can turn all those to being negative arguments if you win that definition, right? And you can say, here are a bunch of models in which private property rights do exist, right? And they're done in a way that's helpful to folks, right? So you can just go back and rewatch that section of the video and repurpose those arguments. Just wanted to mention that one more time because I think, again, just as with the app, that's a very clean-cut way for the negative to have a big advantage in the debate. Turning to new arguments, the first one on my outline is private ownership and development dramatically improve standards of living. So we talked earlier about how we can expect many affirmatives to come in with critiques of capitalism. So here's a radical idea. If we know that a lot of AFs are coming to attack capitalism, rather than trying to like outflank them and be even more progressive or dodge the argument, why don't we just maybe square up and just fight them and argue that capitalism isn't perfect, it has some serious rough edges, but as an empirical historical matter, it's actually done a lot of good for human beings, right? So let's just step away from space for just a second and talk about capitalism generally, right? And talk about the defenses of it. So for example, we start with the point that countries that protect private property rights and are generally a lot better off than others. So this is a piece from Benjamin Powell of the Mercatus Center in 2002. And what he does is he looks at different countries that are ranked by various indices like the Fraser Index and the Heritage Index of how much they protect private property rights and how much they respect economic freedom. And what he finds is that the countries that rank higher in respect for property rights and economic freedom do much better in pretty much every major measure of human development. So on overall GDP, he found that the top quintile for the Fraser Index has a per capita GDP of 22,600, while the bottom bottom quintile averages 2,773. He talks about how average life expectancy at birth is much higher in countries that respect economic freedom and property rights under these indices, right? These indexes. So more generally, though, there's a strong case to be made that capitalism in very practical terms alleviates massive human suffering. This is from Josh Swan of the University of Birmingham in 2020, just talking about the massive benefits of capitalism. And I'll just read a little bit of it. Fundamentally, it must be said straight away that capitalism has been and still is an incredibly overwhelming positive force for the world, and is easily the most successful economic system that has ever been produced. Work is more fulfilling as dull jobs have been automated, creative careers becoming more numerous. Incredible advances in medicine, accountancy, and professional services have been made under capitalism, and essential products like the television have seen a 98% fall in real price since 1950. Capitalism as a form of trade and enterprise has been the engine of the immense reduction in absolute world poverty. In the past 200 years, extreme poverty has collapsed from a whopping 94% of the entire world population to less than 10% today, with 60,000 people escaping extreme poverty every day because of trade. And Swan goes on to argue that attempts to contend that these advances aren't due to capitalism fail because the correlation is just too strong. And he points to this chart, which illustrates per capita global GDP throughout all of human history, or our best estimate of it, right? And as you can see, it plods along close to zero, very, very low, below $1,000, per year for most of human history. And then in the 19th century, which is exactly when modern capitalism is taking off in Western countries, right, it just shoots straight up like a hockey stick, right, to something like today 15 times greater per person wealth adjusted for inflation. And he concludes, with huge rises in global wealth, dramatic reduction of poverty, and the standard of living reaching new heights, it is calculated that since 1800, the average world citizen today is 120 times better off than their 1800 counterpart. Anyone with an internet connection has far more access to knowledge, education, art, and culture that was reserved for high elites and kings not long ago. Never before have so many people lived so well in history. In short, this is me talking, we should be thanking all the Fords and the IBMs and the Amazons for the massive absolute increases in the welfare of all humanity. And if any aft debater tells you that private appropriation links to capitalism, I agree, and that is a reason to instantly vote for the neg, because capitalism is fantastic. Now, I realize that some of you out there are like, Brett, how can you say these things? Well, I'm a centrist Democrat, and I believe there are a lot of rough edges and flaws in capitalism, but I've yet to hear a narrative in which a system that doesn't allow for a certain measure of private enterprise could create these massive improvements in human welfare, the incentives needed, right, to allow people to go out and create all these wonderful things from medicine to technology to infrastructure and transportation. The incentives needed to get people to risk and to innovate and do these things just did not exist before they were allowed to make profits, right? No matter how progressive you are, that's something you have to wrestle with, right? Something you have to at least potentially acknowledge, particularly if you're walking into a debate round in a nice suit with a laptop. How do you explain the irony of that, right? Not to lecture, but it's a side you need to consider if you're one of these markedly progressive debaters, right? And another point on this is that without private property rights, we can expect that development in space will not happen, or at minimum, it will happen extremely slowly, right? So now let's start tying these arguments about capitalism back into space development specifically. Basically, even just near Earth space, right, where we put satellites, is far too vast, right, for international or national level alone, development alone to even scratch the surface, right? So by prohibiting private appropriation, we basically remove from the table massive game-changing benefits for all of humanity. Under the status quo, where national claims of sovereignty are barred by international law, by the Outer Space Treaty, private appropriation is literally the only option. If governments don't recognize some kind of enforceable property right, why would anybody ever invest the huge amounts of capital or take the massive risks that are necessary to seize the benefits of space development, right? So David Collins in 2008 wrote this piece on why Mars development requires private property rights. And he says, equal distribution of Martian land in line with the common heritage principle would lead to no profit in the economic sense and would inevitably result in the tragedy of the commons, the risk of self-interested overexploitation or underexploitation of shared resources. If each nation nation or person has an equal claim to Mars as a matter of right and not as a function of their actual contribution, then non-spacefaring nations and their taxpayers will avoid contributing to efforts to reach and develop Mars. No country is likely to undertake the enormous risks, economic and otherwise, associated with Mars colonization without the legal certainty that their rewards will not be distributed to others. Similarly, Ezra Reinstein noted in 1999 on the need for property rights to incentivize development. Humanity's welfare demands that we alter the current law to allow real estate ownership, not just usufructory, it's a new word for me, usufructory rights to those who would best develop land and space. The potential wealth of outer space in the form of minerals, energy, living space doesn't do us any good unless we're able to harness it. And as Jeffrey Cargill, a planetary scientist, has written, if you want to cross the bridge into the 21st century of space development, then space must pay its way and give private investors a handsome early return on investment. And the reason why you have to have these private property interests in order to make this happen is partly because government space exploration has stagnated. This is from Eric Berger, writing in Ars Technica in 2016 on the stagnation of NASA. And he notes that the Apollo program succeeded because it was the top priority of the President of the United States. And its success was linked directly to the national interest of the country. America was fighting a Cold War, and the best way to prove to the world that democracy was superior was to achieve something like landing on the moon. After that strategic significance faded, so too did NASA's budget, beginning a decline from the late 1960s of 4.5% of the federal budget to less than 0.5% today. Without, and this is me talking, without an obvious goal like putting people on the moon, government investment in space development is going to take a back seat. Voters are going to say, look, hold on, if we've got millions of Americans living below the poverty line, if we've got climate change, why are we dumping billions of dollars in public tax money to mine an asteroid? And there actually may be a good reason why we should do that, but voters aren't going to listen to that, right? Not generally. And that fact, coupled with the global commons approach of the OST, the Outer Space Treaty, is why government just can't carry the primary load of developing outer space, just like government couldn't go out and like literally build the farms on the western frontier in the United States. But it's important that somebody do it, right? Because, and this is the next point of my outline, space development will massively benefit all of humanity. AF may want to understate just how beneficial outer space development might be. It might want to gainsay it and say, well, we can take it or leave it, right? It's not urgent. Well, the negative wants to say, no, it is urgent that we get out there and government's not doing it. So next point I have is large-scale outer space mining fights climate change. This is from the MIT Technology Review in 2018. And what it points out is that a kilogram of platinum mined from an asteroid would release 150 kilograms of CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere from the launch to get the vehicle there. When economies of scale take over and large-scale mining operations ratchet up, that will be reduced to 60 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of platinum. How does that compare to Earth-based mining? The mining industry, not environmental groups, the mining industry estimates that producing 1 kilogram of platinum on Earth releases 40,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So we will be reducing the carbon footprint of mining, just for one example, right, of producing minerals by multiple orders of magnitude by moving that out into space. Governments aren't doing this. The only people talking about doing this right now are private corporations that have ambitions to start doing this, and we need to let them. In addition, in terms of benefits to humanity, space mining meets all human mineral needs for centuries. This is from Kashyap Vyas. I think I'm saying that right, but I'm probably not. This is in 2019, and it talks about how, it is presumed that some asteroids, individual asteroids, contain iron, nickel, or cobalt in sufficient quantities to cover the Earth's needs for 3,000 years. Bernstein's Wall Street research firm says a large asteroid called 16 Psyche in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, with an extension of 200 kilometers wide, could contain enough nickel ore to cover the current human demand for millions of years. And of course, you can also argue that private outer space development is essential to establishing off-world settlements that provide a lifeboat for our species, right? The basic idea is that these outer space colonies are going to require massive amounts of minerals, massive amounts of water for sustaining life and making fuel. And to do that, we've got to get out into the solar system and start mining that stuff and start producing facilities and making facilities that can do that. Public entities are not investing in those activities. As a matter of fact, in the status quo, governments are not doing that, and they are not giving you any indication that they're going to do that. So we have to rely on private investment to get us to Mars, to get us off Earth, so we have a lifeboat, right? So we have some chance to avoid extinction in the event of some catastrophic event on Earth, and we don't keep all our species' eggs in one basket. Next point in the outline is private property rights are essential to prevent plundering scarce space resources. Now, this is a little bit of a squirrel argument that sort of reverses AF concerns about private entities plundering the resources of outer space to argue, no, actually, the only way to prevent those resources from being plundered or just wasted is to allocate property rights and create incentives for companies or groups or organizations, nonprofits, whoever, to go out, invest, own them, protect them, and extract them in an efficient manner. This is from Joel Shiraga of the Cato Institute. It's way back in 1987, but it's just a logical economic argument, so it really does still hold water, right? And he just makes this common sense argument that recognizing and protecting property rights are actually essential to avoid squandering space resources. And what he says is the argument for establishing property rights in outer space is that the failure to assign property rights to scarce resources will inevitably lead to an inefficient use of the resources. The problem is a common one in economics. Consider, for example, the overhunting of the buffalo on the Great Plains. The opportunity cost of hunting the buffalo was zero. They were overhunted and killed almost to the point of extinction because no one owned them. The few remaining buffalo survived only because laws that established property rights to the remaining buffalo and their unborn offspring finally protected them. As applied to outer space, this implies that an efficient use of scarce orbital slots, he's talking about orbital slots, but you can apply this to anything, will result once property rights are assigned unambiguously so the owner can sell them for whatever the market would offer. And this is using an economic concept that I mentioned briefly earlier called the tragedy of the commons, right? If a finite resource is held in common by many people, but nobody owns it, nobody can exclude others, nobody can sell it, right? Well, then the incentive is for each person in that common group to just go out and take as much as possible, right? And eventually you're left with nothing. It's like the fruit tree in the middle of town that nobody owns. Well, they're going to keep picking it until it's dead, basically. You know, keep taking from it. Nobody's going to have an incentive to prune it or take care of it or pull up the weeds or anything. They're just going to take the fruit. And in terms of space, the idea would be if we declare that private appropriation is unjust and we don't recognize the rights of those who claim the property, that decision, ironically, is exactly what is going to fuel a mad dash to drain the resources. Companies will look at that and say, well, boys, because they are mostly boys, well, boys, we're never going to be able to own any of this stuff or have any protection of it. So if we don't get out there now and start strip mining these things right now, somebody else is going to come take it. We can't own it. We can't buy it. We can't claim it. We better get out there and start stripping as much as we can out, whether it's useful, whether it's efficient, whether we know how to do it safely, doesn't matter, right? In terms of satellite orbits, we try to avoid this situation by assigning orbits through the International Telecommunications Union, but that is proven inadequate because, again, we don't assign true, robust property rights. But when it comes to mining and things like that, we have absolutely nothing like this. So ironically, again, the incentive will be for mega corporations to go out and start stripping these things as fast as they can because they know they'll never be able to assert any enforceable right to them. It really will be first come, first serve without orderly allocation of property rights. So the better approach is to have property rights and do them in an orderly way. Next point is that, ironically, private enterprise is actually dramatically lowering the barriers to access space. And this is mainly a block to the idea we mentioned earlier about these high barriers to entry leading the ultra-rich to dominate space-based development. And the response is really just, yes, it's true. It has been prohibitively expensive to put things into orbit, but private companies are dramatically lowering those costs and opening the way for space to be more egalitarian, not less. And this is from Professor Wendy Cobb in 2019 on private development, lowering cost of access to space. And she says SpaceX's most significant achievement has been lowering the launch costs that have limited many space activities. While making several modifications to the fuel and engine, SpaceX's major breakthroughs have come through recovering and reusing as much of the rocket and launch vehicle as possible. Between 1970 and 2000, the cost to launch a kilogram to space remained fairly steady with an average of $18,500 US per kilogram. When the space shuttle was in operation, it could launch a payload of 27,500 kilograms for $1.5 billion, or $54,000 per kilogram. For a SpaceX Falcon 9, the rocket used to access the International Space Station, the cost is just $2,720 per kilogram. So the takeaway here is, AF is saying space is a rich person's game. Answer is, yes, it is. It always has been. Whether that rich person is a private billionaire or a public agency, right? And the only way we democratize space and the only way we lower the barriers to entry and drive the cost of entry down, the only way that's happening is via private development to make that access cheaper, right? On a related point, private ownership is essential to allow non-spacefaring nations and their people to benefit from space development. Unfortunately, I don't have a card on this, but I think it's a pretty strong common sense argument, right? Let me explain what I mean. The alternative to private appropriation is not going to be some peaceful cooperation, kumbaya situation where countries go out and work diligently to mine asteroids and share. We're talking about a handful of countries that are going to have the ability to do that. We're talking about the US, China, maybe Russia, the UK, Germany. That's probably about it. Maybe a few more, right? First world developed powers and superpowers, right? So in a system that allows private appropriations, citizens that aren't in these countries, from non-spacefaring countries, are going to have the opportunity to influence and benefit from exploration and development by investing in these private firms that carry out the exploration. Even poor people in poor countries who don't invest in the stock market can benefit or influence through their governments investing, like large pension funds and things like that, into the profits that come from these companies. By contrast, in a world where private appropriation is barred, right, people residing in countries that can't compete, that can't get into space, right, are going to be completely frozen out. Right? The bar of space exploration is completely impossible for most people and most nations in the world, and it's only going to become harder to clear as current superpowers seize the low-hanging fruit like orbital development and the moon and move on to the next frontiers, which are like Mars, asteroids, the moons of Jupiter, and things like that. Now, SpaceX isn't a publicly traded company yet, but you're definitely going to see publicly traded companies, which gives literally everyone and every government in the world to get a piece of the action, to be able to vote for the directors and to have influence on outer space. In a world where only governments can do it, most of the world will be frozen out. In a world where private entities can do it, anyone can buy in and have some influence in the process, right? The last point I have on the neg is that private ownership is actually less dangerous than state ownership. People say things like, oh, I don't trust Elon Musk, or I don't trust Jeff Bezos. Great, I don't either, right? But that's not really the question, is it? Somebody's going to go out in outer space and develop it. And the question is, who do you mistrust less? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos on the one hand, or the US government, the Russian government, the Chinese government on the other hand. No matter what, somebody is going to take ownership of outer space resources. The United States is already chomping at the bit, passing laws, executive orders saying it wants this to happen, right? If we, through this resolution, right, prohibit it, it's still going to be somebody. It's going to be the government, right? Space is not going to sit idle for all eternity, no matter what the Outer Space Treaty says. So who's going to develop it? And the answer is it's safer for private entities to do it than just governments. So O'Connell and Salter in 2021 talk about capitalist peace in outer space. And what they say is that commercial ties often work well in securing peace among nations. Bombing your trading partner is bad for business. Eric Gartsky, a political scientist at the University of California, San Diego, calls this capitalist peace. As on Earth, so in space. Countries will hesitate to interfere with each other's space operations if it means forfeiting economic gains from space wealth. China and Russia will probably never sign the Artemis Accords, but they don't need to. As long as we make trading rather than raiding worth their while, we can prevent celestial conflict from escalating. Securing buy-in from these potential rivals is essential for mankind's future in space. Property rights to space resources are key to promoting celestial good citizenship. In other words, if companies from nation A start extracting a resource from asteroids or the moon, and then they sell it to nation B at a reasonable price, making nation B better off and more prosperous, then nation B is a lot less likely to go to war with nation A than if nation A just went and claimed the asteroid or the moon and didn't do anything with it, which is what they're doing. This is why the United States doesn't go to war with China, right? Because we're both so dependent on each other for trade. And since most of the wars in history were fought over some kind of scarce resource, this is a really powerful argument. In the end, just like trade ties make major power wars much less likely on Earth, private development in outer space, particularly by multinational companies with shareholders all over the world, is much more likely to create an interdependent, relatively peaceful international order than a model in which only nation states go out there and basically try to grab up as much sovereign territory as possible. So that's what I have on the neg. Again, a wide diversity of arguments, really fun resolution on both sides. Let's come back in just 1 second for a few quick final thoughts. Okay, some really quick final thoughts because this has been a really long video. Just a few things. This is a complicated topic that's about an issue that most judges don't intuitively know a ton about. Cards and evidence are great, but putting it in context, telling a clear story, and explaining what is at issue on a practical level is absolutely essential for the judge, right? At minimum, you need to be doing this at the beginning of the round via a clear top case, maybe an observation, maybe definitions, maybe just some narrative, right? And you need to do it at the end of the round as you sum up your voting issues. You will notice on this topic, I've done a little bit more of just like looking at the camera and sort of making the argument, right? Explaining it, not just reading, cards and stuff like that. You need to be doing a little bit more of that in the round as well, because again, it's not like legalizing drugs. Judges may not intuitively grasp what is at stake, right? Secondly and lastly, there are so many angles on this topic that hard work preparing a robust block file and back file is going to be really rewarding. Debaters who put in the work and know all the different angles are going to be rewarded a lot. We didn't even have time in an hour and a half video to really touch much on things like critical theory, space tourism, things along those lines. Also, I know that this one came out a little bit late, so we appreciate your patience. We really appreciate you waiting on it. But if you haven't already gotten to work, get that back file done because it's going to reward you over the next 2 months at some really important tournaments. So anyway, really appreciate your patience as we got this one out. I think it's been a productive video. Wish you guys and gals the best of luck in January, February, and we will see you in March when we get around to national qualifiers and TOC type stuff. For more fun, but until then, we will sign off as we always do with remember, debate is for everybody, so work hard, have fun, and Hail State.